At this point, let me quickly introduce the two new members of the panel up here. Professor Juan Cole, Professor of Middle Eastern History in the Department of History at the University of Michigan. Probably barely in need of an introduction in a forum like this. Who has worked extensively on the Shia and also on the modern Middle East in many different contexts. And Professor Catherine Babayan from the Department of Near Eastern Studies. And then at this point, let me turn the podium over, or the microphone, to Professor Babayan, who's going to moderate this part of the event. And please join me in welcoming the new members of the panel here.
Thank you, and good afternoon to this concluding roundtable session. I take my role really as a facilitator of the discussion. I wanted to begin by thanking Roland for bringing us all here together, and all of the speakers who've really illuminated all of these different multi-dimensions of Musa al-Sadr, both historically as well as his legacy and this institutionalization of his legacy amongst the Shia community today in America and in Lebanon. So I think this is a unique moment, this conference, where we are actually able to bring together and bridge together in some way, I hope, in a dialogue, members of the community, very distinguished members of the community, but devotees also of Imam Musa al-Sadr, as well as historians who are trying to take a more objective perspective. That is sort of a rare encounter, and I hope we are all able to learn from one another. I wanted to just start off with a couple of broader questions to place Imam Musa al-Sadr and Shi'ism and the politicization of Shi'ism in a larger frame. And since I'm an Iranist, I was thinking of these issues that have been brought up around religion and secularism, issues that are obviously not only pertinent to the Islamic world today, but the Shi'i revolution in Iran, I think, had a very particular effect in really world history, and that is that we've seen till now, with the Protestant Reformation, for instance, the secularization of religion. And a phenomena that we see with the Iranian Revolution, at the building of the Iranian Revolution with the different discourses that were in circulation, that we actually have the religification, a very cumbersome word, I don't know what else to use, of in fact secular discourse, and in particular leftist discourse, so that a scholar like Negin Nabavi has worked on how so much, not only is there a sharing of these ideas of social justice, but also religious symbolisms and languages that enter into leftist discourses, revolutionary discourses. And what I wondered how different is the case of the Shia in Lebanon? Rula, you've talked about how even though Imam Musa al-Sadr was attempting to distance himself and differentiate himself from the left, I'm wondering, as you talked about yourself in your very illuminating lecture today, this dynamic. We're looking just at Shiism. We're just looking at the Shia in Lebanon. And we don't really look at other kinds of secular discourses that are also affected by this new consciousness and awareness of the Shia within this revolutionary moment. So my first question would be to try to talk a little bit and see differences, and even to invite Professor Hagen, who is aware of what's going on in Turkey, whether is this a particular Shia phenomena, or even Professor Abu Nasr, to see whether there is that religification of the secular discourses of opposition in Egypt as well. My second sort of point has more to do with these different categories that we've been talking about, namely reform, modernism, what else? Moderation, radicalism. And I'm wondering how do we place Imam Musa al-Sadr within this larger movement of opposition in the Islamic world? And I'm thinking of Professor Khaled Abu Fadl's work on the Great Theft, where he sees that this moderate, this voice that isn't radical enough in terms of taking a particular stance against Israel, of being supporters of the Palestinian movement, of also taking issues of social egalitarianism, that moderate voice that was more prominent, at least in the medieval world, due to certain kinds of structural aspects, namely the proliferation of spaces of learning, like the seminaries, the fact that now a lot of this discourse of opposition is coming out of hobby ulama like Zarqawi, who are sort of engineers and are taking up themselves religion. And so that has not allowed for pluralism to begin with, but has not allowed for a particular moderate voice to emerge. And it seems to me, from what you've been talking about, that may have been this moment of enthusiasm that Imam Musa al-Sadr entered into the Lebanese political and cultural landscape was a problem for his support. One thing, and I will end with that I didn't come out with understanding clearly, were precisely these sort of gestures about social networks, the social formations that were so specific to the kind of work that Imam Musa al-Sadr did in particular in Jabal Amel. And what can we touch these a little bit? Can we have a little bit of a fabric of these networks who supported him as he was trying to also disassociate himself with the Shia left, who are very engaged, and students who are very radical? How did he come to gain a following? Did his discourses around citizenship actually, who did it appeal to? Who were the people who came to follow, break away from other, let's say, leftist Shi'a movements? So I will just end with those questions. And whoever wants to take on, you have to put it. Sure.
Well, that's a very rich set of dynamics and questions that's been laid before us. I hope it will provoke a lot of comment. Let me just add a couple more to it, because it seems to me that one of the difficulties in understanding Imam Musa al-Sadr is his role as what the French would call a bricoleur. They have this concept of bricolage. And we can't have a proper academic conference at the University of Michigan without at least bringing in one French word. But what they mean by that is actually quite simple, which is that, there's a distinction between an engineering project where you plan it all out and it's all got straight lines and you've done the math on it and so forth, and cobbling together something out of material that is at hand. And the cobbling together is the bricolage. And it seems to me that modern political parties, and I would say Hezbollah among them, are more like the engineering work. They've got platforms, they've got goals they're trying to achieve, they've got constituencies that they're trying to please and so forth. But that Musa al-Sadr arrived in Lebanon and was active at a particular moment in history where that kind of party activity among the Shia was much more difficult to arrange. They weren't as socially mobilized and so forth. And that therefore, he was on the stage of Lebanon at that moment as a bricoleur. And that seems to me how we understand that we find him in a Catholic church preaching the Sunday sermon. And remember that in Lebanon at that time, these boundaries were quite strict. I mean, there were a lot of Shia who would have considered the Catholics to be ritually impure, and there were a lot of Catholics who wouldn't have wanted a Shiite clergyman in their church. And because he was an outsider, I think, he could transgress those boundaries. I was in Lebanon at the time that he was active, and I heard him speak. And at that time, I was amazed at how much the Lebanese hid from themselves their neighbors, because they would live next to one another in places like West Beirut and so forth. But I was interested in religion and their traditions, and I would ask a Catholic about their views of Islam, and it would gradually be clear to me that they had no idea what it was that their Muslim neighbors believed. And the same thing was often true of the Muslims about the Christians. But he transgressed those boundaries, and he put together new kinds of alliances, sidestepped the Zaim system, the Oserans and the old landlords and so forth, and addressed, I think, a growing middle class. And one of his essays is very interesting. I think one of the ways that he did this was his philosophy, which I think was influenced by the Ishraqi school, by the Illuminationist school of Persian philosophy. But he wrote an essay on religion, and he said, well, why do we have lots of different religions, and what is religion, and so forth? And he said, well, you know, God's voice has spoken to human beings at different times and in different contexts, and these religions have grown up as a response to hearing that voice in that time and place, and that therefore are lent a distinctiveness and a peculiarity having to do with when and where they were formed. But the voice that they were responding to was one voice. And in a Lebanese context, I would say that writing that in 1975 was quite revolutionary. And it's an aspect of his bricolage, of his ability to put together these various materials that he had before him into something that was new and dynamic, and which helped, I think, begin to stitch together a Lebanon that wasn't just a Lebanon of a few warlords meeting in a back room.
Yes. This is, of course, you know, a very complicated question, but I can talk a little bit about my experiences, how I came across this material. I was actually looking at A'yan al-Shi'a by Sayyid Muhsin al-Amin, and looking at al-Hawzat al-Ilmiya, what happens actually with the whole concept of reforming Islamic law, and how does Sayyid Muhsin al-Amin gets to be seen as a reformist. And of course, what you come across is that the term reform is a very problematic concept, because the only way it emerges is out of a colonial modernist discourse, that Islamic institutions, Islamic doctrines, Islamic orthopraxy is in decline, it's an ailing body, and it needs to be saved. So that to be modern is to reform Islamic law. And so I came across that, and I started to find, of course, that in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, there has been a generation of scholars, children of leading theologians and clerics, who go to Najaf to study, and somewhere there they turn Marxist, and some of them actually join the Communist Party. It is not an insignificant, it's actually quite a significant phenomenon. And to explain it as, well, this is turning to secularism and leaving religion is problematic. Because Sayyid Hassan al-Amin says, for example, about Hussein Mroui, who studied for 14 years in Najaf. He didn't continue at the Hawza. He wanted to become a mujtahid. He really did not, against of probably what many communist leaders have said about him, that he wanted to desert the Hawza, that he shunned religious education, he looked down at it. I actually believe he really had a very sincere desire of becoming a mujtahid. But he always talked about trying to open a modern space in the Hawza, of entertaining new questions. And this didn't happen. He was accused of ilhad, of atheism, and he was rejected. And he contemplated, I think those of you who have read his memoirs, he's an amazing thinker. He contemplated committing suicide. He looked at, just after he was pushed out. But the point I wanted to continue with this, your question is quite important. The two children, three of the children of Sayyid Muhsin al-Amin, you know, he's the mujtahid, the major mujtahid. Two of them, turned to socialist thought. One of them did, but did not join the Communist Party out of respect to his father. In the Iraqi experience, you have similar stories coming out. When the son of Kashif al-Ghita, the very famous Ayatollah, his son, basically translates this small book on Bolsheviks, and it gets to be circulated in Najaf. Sheikh, of course, Sheikh Hani Fahad says that he got introduced to Sartre and Marx in the Hausa. Now, this is a testimony. This is where my interpretation differs. This is a testimony to how fascinating the intellectual atmosphere of the Hausa was. They were experimenting with these ideas. But again, the question is, why do you have, for example, a Sayyid, a Shiite Sayyid who was the head of the Iraqi Communist Party, and then you have the major ideologues of the Communist Party in Lebanon, Shiite. And we're talking about first-rate, really, first-rate theoreticians. Mahdi Amil, of course, is another important one. So there was, so maybe Marxism was that they needed to battle Marxism. And the exchange with Marxism was very complicated. There was a fascination with the modernist aspect of it. And I think, in my analysis in the book that I hopefully will come out in Stanford, my analysis is that the messianic tenet, the absence of the state traditionally in Shiite thought, the waiting for the Imam, and the Karbala'i interpretation of history, creates this kind of tendency to be against injustice. And Marxism talks about being against injustice. And there are moments then when Marxist types of morality against injustice and the Shiite kind of really very, I mean, injustice is a very strong thing for the Shiites, that they come together. And the clerics, of course, now wanted to deal with this dilemma. Because what it actually meant for Sayyid Musa al-Sadr is that these people are not going to accept the state. They're not going to want to be citizens. They're always seeing themselves as outside the state. And his project was to turn them into citizens of the state. That, for the leftist Shiites, that was actually not a good project. They actually were very happy being outside the state and continuing to be against the state and actually trying to find the opportunity to destroy the state. And Sayyid Musa did not think that was realistic, and he did not think that was fruitful. But there's a lot to be said about this engagement between the two. And I would not say also that the leftists were themselves have cut their ties with religion. You know, Hussein Mroui, how Sayyid Hassan al-Amin describes him as having a dialogue with religion, that he had never really considered himself an atheist. He was buried in Syria, you know, in the cemetery of Sayyida Zainab. And all of that it shows that there is a very provincial and very special way of seeing Marxism. I mean, these are people who actually would be at the Husayniyah, commemorating Ashura. And then some of the communists would come and they would say, you know, we have to rise against, you know, there's an aggression against the Palestinians, or they have raised the prices of gas and food. And they will rush out in a protest from the Husayniyas sometimes, embracing some of the demands of the communists. It was natural. It was not imposed from the outside. It was not a Western-educated communist who come and told them, you know, I'm going to teach you about Althusser and Marx, and you listen. It was very popular, very grass movement type. That's my reading.
Some reflection on what Rola mentioned, and just to add one more dimension from my personal experience as someone who was raised in a purely religious and spiritual environment. If you examine the history of religious families in Iran, in Iraq, and even Lebanon, you would find, as Rola mentioned, that many of those who hailed from prominent religious families, and some of them were either the children or the grandchildren of grand ayatollahs in Iran, they left religion. They became either communists, leftists, secular, even atheists. And that tells you a lot. Even Rola mentioned some names in Lebanon and Iraq, and the leader of the Tudeh party, communist party, main communist party in Iran, was a son of a grand Ayatollah. And that tells you a lot about the failure of the religious establishment and some religious scholars in raising their kids, in dealing, not only raising their kids, not only a family issue, but also it tells you a lot about their, their mind and their behavior in dealing with issues from only one side, So when their kids would raise and go to have another opportunity to interact with others and get disengaged from that closed-minded environment, they would, shun religion and try to run away from it. And it's still happening even at our modern times in Iraq. And, I know many children, male and female children of grand ayatollahs who tell you, I don't believe in God, although my father is a prominent, religious leader, but I don't believe in God. And that's an area that deserves some attention.
I want to say something about the social networks that you talked. Thanks. Social networks that you asked, and I was reminded of two different Amal memories that I saw and interviewed. One of them was a middle-class Shiite who told me at that time he was the only student at the AUB and who got attracted to Musa al-Sadr and the Amal movement because he was always wondering why he's the only Shia, and his family was the only Shiite family living in West Beirut back in the 60s. And the other one is now the head of the Amal Education Center, who considered himself, and used the word, that I was a mahroom, I was a disadvantaged person living in the southern suburbs of Beirut, and we didn't have any access to good schools. And so as that, I was of course attracted to Musa al-Sadr's message. So I think we can say that there were at least two groups that were sort of the basis of the Harakat al-Mahrumin. One was the sort of emerging middle class, those who had also gone to Africa, come back and could not, needed that sort of cultural capital and the promise of sort of symbolic capital that Musa al-Sadr was promising for them. We are not the lower class and the anti-modern. And I think the lower classes, and I know the distinction is an artificial one, trying to say that there is, those who were only seeking to have economic advancement and those who were seeking symbolic capital. But in a way, for the middle class, I think the symbolic capital was important. For the others, the promise of a better life. I think that was, so those were the two groups, but I'm sure, were there other groups that you would address that were attracted to Musa al-Sadr's message?
It changed over time, though. It did change over time. I think that with Harakat al-Mahrumin, we see actually that a section of the industrial proletariat in the suburbs, يعني في النبع, become at that time more recipient. They really pay attention more closely to him. There are also a segment of the peasants, but really for the most part, the middle classes. Yeah. I think that would be, yeah.
What happened to the Zohar? Were they all killed? Did they all immigrate? Did they reinvent themselves? Were they a state of occultation? I mean, they're bypassed.
They got replaced, but now being buried in most recent Zohar. Yeah. Always.
Yeah, but he's a
What-
different kind of
In fact, where they go?
They became political mummies.
Well, I think it's important to look at the political economy of this, because what was the possibility of the Zaims, or really these big landowners of what were more or less what we would think of in Latin American terms as haciendas. That possibility was there because the South was relatively undeveloped. There were relatively few good roads, there was very little electricity, there was very little mechanization of agriculture, so you had the peasants all working in the tobacco fields of this hacienda under the thumb of the Zaim. And all of that changed, really beginning with the Shahab period and later, and it accelerated into the 70s, so that you do get electrification, you do get roads, you get this big immigration of people to the southern suburbs of Beirut as you get some light industrialization in Beirut. And then you get a mechanization of agriculture, which throws a lot of peasants off the ground, off of the land. So that social formation of the big tobacco haciendas, it seems to me, is what created the political power of the Oseirans and others. And as that social condition changed, so new forms of political power started to emerge. And of course, there were new forms of communication, the transistor radio, later on television, and so forth. And so that you begin to get a replacement of that personalistic kind of landed power with essentially middle-class political parties and new forms of social organization. So I don't think the Oseirans went anywhere. It's just the atmosphere within which they functioned changed very dramatically. I mean, Fuad Ajami has this story at the beginning of his book about how the peasant brought a sheep to the landlord on Eid in sort of weeping and hoping the landlord would please accept it from him. And it really is feudal in the sense that that's laying an obligation on the landlord to take care of him later on, obviously, and he gets so happy when the landlord takes his sheep. Well, that story is from Fuad's youth, and 20 years later, there weren't any peasants giving sheep to landlords.
Of course, it changes shape, but when I'm talking about Nabi Berri, if you think about the power he has in the Council of the South, he has created a patronage system in the South in terms of, well, you give me your vote and I give you the contract for some reconstruction or some new building. So there is that aspect going on. Of course, it's not the old families.
It's not based in a hacienda.
Yeah, it's, but...
So they adapt to the new social order and just go around doing other things?
Yes.
Well, for instance, one member of the Assad family, who we've mentioned repeatedly, obviously, as Juan mentioned, they're still there. One recently ran and lost in a parliamentary election, and he had tried to reinvent himself as the Islamic candidate and had all sorts of slogans to that effect. So the landholding Zuama may have vanished in the Shia tradition, but I can assure you they're alive and well in the Druze community and others. And there's a whole rich methodological framework for analyzing this concept of Zaim and in Lebanon. But the different sects came to it with different backgrounds, and it was in the Shia community, it had to do with the relationship between the Ottomans and the Shias, mediated by these landholding families. But in the Christian case, that's not necessarily the case. A lot of them used the army as a way to advance and gain networks and gain power.
There was also the silk industry, which created the bourgeoisie.
Yes, and so each of these sects have different, histories of how they gain these patronage networks. But I think if you look at the way these gentlemen pull up in their motorcades and get together once a year to decide the presidency and so forth, I think, they haven't really gone anywhere necessarily.
I wonder that what is the effect of Hariri government on these processes in Lebanon? If please give some comment.
The Hariri government on the Zaims? Well, Hariri is, of course, the new Zaim. But again, I mean, I'm arguing that the Lebanese, Zaim doesn't just mean leader. So obviously leadership is always there. But I'm arguing that there was a kind of leader which was rooted in a particular set of social formations in the first half of the 20th century in Lebanon, and that kind of leadership has been eclipsed. And the Hariri family is a very good example of it, because Hariri's father goes off to Saudi Arabia, and really in a very humble kind of condition initially, and rises through patronage and gets close to the royal family and accumulates, it is said, $4 billion and so forth. And then King Fahd becomes more and more annoyed with the disturbances in the Levant and decides to send him back to be his envoy. And being the envoy of King Fahd turns into something for Hariri in terms of Lebanese politics. And he plays, I think, a really important role in the Taif settlement and its aftermath in trying to stitch Lebanon back together after the war. But Hariri's base for politics is that abroad, whereas some of the other Lebanese Shia have the West Africa abroad, and some of the Sunnis have the Gulf abroad, and the Maronites have the French abroad. And so in many ways, and of course Nabi Berri is known as the American, you know, he's our guy from Dearborn. So I mean, I think the sources of social power in Lebanon, in a funny sort of way, become increasingly cosmopolitan in the 21st century. And it's no longer the indigenous haciendas and that kind of, or the silk factories or whatever that are producing social power as much as wealth and influence and connections in various corners of the Middle East and Europe and America.
I think Imam Musa al-Sadr's appeal was more than that. It was cross-sectional. I mean, nobody mentioned that Imam Musa al-Sadr had companions like now prominent newspaperman Ghassan Twaini, for instance. He was one of his people that joined his social cause. Also, there's reverends like Reverend Gregoire Haddad and Ab Joachim Mbarak. And these were prominent. Even the Patriarch of Lebanon, he formed a South Lebanon League with him. And the social networking did not stay with the peasants and nouveau riche or middle class, but it was much wider than that. The other thing I want to comment on is that Nabi Berri had the quid pro quo mentality in the south of Lebanon. South of Lebanon was a very deprived area. There's a huge difference between Kamel al-Assad's era and Nabi Berri's era. Nabi Berri used to give contracts to people who are deserving contracts because South Lebanon was, never before was developed like this. These contracts were to further the development of South Lebanon. Now in every village, remote village in South Lebanon, you have at least 2 schools. You have electricity, you have infrastructure. So it's a wide, difference between during Kamel Assad's era and Nabi Berri's era. There's 400 schools right now in South Lebanon since Nabi Berri took over.
Yeah, my point was not to say that that patronage system doesn't lead into actually the construction, but to whom he gives the contracts. Yes, they do build the school, and that's the end of it is good, but he chooses clearly to whom, he gives a contract. That's a patronage system. I mean, I've done research on the Majlis al-Junub, and everybody knows about that. I mean, it's called Majlis al-Juyub. I mean, we all know that. So,
how come someone from the Shia Council wasn't chosen to lead after Musa al-Sadr? Why was a civilian chosen, not a cleric after him?
well,
They looked for somebody civilian to lead Amal, after him. Why wasn't somebody from the Shia Council chosen? And how was the Shia Council developed? Or what was his intent for the development of the Shia Council as far as leadership for the future?
I'm going to try and answer this. There is an important difference between the function of the council and what it does, and the qualifications of someone who is in the council. You also have the Sharia committee at the council that was formed. I mean, these are experts and practitioners. Sayyid Musa al-Sadr was unique in combining different elements, where he could be actually a faqih and deal with the law, and at the same time be a political leader. This is not something that you are going to find in other members, probably, of the council, who are really experts in particular fields. I mean, their job is really, management of al-ahwal al-shakhsiyya. They are representing the Shiite sect in a certain way. And I don't see how that could work for being the head of أفواج المقاومة اللبنانية, Amal. You would want someone who is not actually, who has a different dimension and expertise and stuff of this sort. We don't know anyone who has combined both these elements like Sayyid Musa al-Sadr. Yeah.
My question is, if anyone, it's to any one of you, can discuss the transition from حركة المستضعفين or حركة المحرومين, sorry, to أفواج المقاومة اللبنانية. What was the transition period there, besides the military occupation? And in retrospect, did Sayyid Musa ever have these kinds of leanings? Was there ever, at the end of his career, was there ever any leanings towards maybe like a more militant resistance, because the civil war had already started? So was there any arming at this time before his actual disappearance?
Amal was created before the beginning of the civil war in 1974, and they were already training in the Palestinian camps. So your question was whether he chose to become. Well, it wasn't a transition. There were, I think, Amal was the military wing of the Harakat al-Mahroumin. I mean, he at some point decided that all the other groups in Lebanon are, up into arms, and that he will have to have some comparable sort of organization. So that wasn't anything unique or extraordinary that he did. And when the civil war started, Amal wasn't actually so much, at the beginning of it, it wasn't so much involved in it until after his disappearance. And then there were clashes in South Lebanon between Palestinian groups mainly, and only sort of after, in '84, when they took over West Beirut.
There is, I think, part of this story is the Jordanian civil war and its aftermath. The PLO formed and started hitting targets in Israel, and then after '67 in the West Bank from Jordan, and the Israelis bombed Jordan and especially bombed King Hussein's facilities and so forth as a way of putting pressure on the Jordanian state to stop the Palestinian guerrillas from infiltrating into the occupied territories. And the King Hussein took on the PLO, basically. They tried to assassinate him. He killed a lot of Palestinians. And the Palestinian activists who survived fled to the camps in southern Lebanon. And they were the first ones, I think, really to start radically displacing the Zaims from South Lebanon, as they inserted themselves into local power networks. And they started training guerrillas, and they started doing the same thing from southern Lebanon that they had been doing from Jordan. And this was going on really from '70 forward. And so I think by '74, it was very clear that the civil atmosphere in southern Lebanon was increasingly dominated by people with training camps and militias and so forth, and that if the Harakat al-Mahroumin was going to amount to anything, it's going to have a military wing. But I see it as a response to the advent of the PLO activists after the civil war in Jordan.
I was thinking that's something I've been thinking about for a while, and Rula talked about it a little bit. It's a question of public religion, and we were, you sort of raised the question about comparing maybe Lebanon and Iran in that debate. And I think what makes Lebanon unique and makes it very complicated, we talked about that, is that it has that institutional form of political sectarianism, that you have the personal status law under the control of the religious leader and the community leaders. And but nonetheless, people talk about the secular government, whereas that's not secular if it's already decided that the president is, whatever, a Maronite and so forth. And so, what kind of public religion? Because what is sort of the difference between the kind of public religion and the debate that's going on in Iran and Lebanon? And I know it's a tough question. I've been thinking about it, but. Yes. Why do people talk about Lebanon as a secular country?
Well, I mean, this is really part of the questions we should be asking. It definitely is not a fully secular state, but it is not a religious state. I think the dilemma is trying to categorize and identify, give it a definition. What is going on is actually in the very foundation of the Lebanese nation state, sectarianism was inscribed for it, as it was created into a modern nation state, it was simultaneously a sectarian state. I mean, political sectarianism. But at the same time, it is secular in the sense that it does not want, basically, public religion, or it tries to confine the role of religion only in parceling access to administration and access to employment. But when it comes to policies, they do not want heads of religious groups. They don't want, for example, the head of the council, Al-Majlis al-Shi'i al-A'la, or, for example, with the Druze or with others, to actually dictate the policies. They don't want them to intervene in economic policies, policies about education, women's work, women's labor.
But we know that that's just really a theoretical distinction. The relation between sort of Berri and Rabbalan is so close, so in the Druze community, so forth. I mean, nothing happens without prior agreements between those two people, the religious and the sort of secular person.
Yes, I mean, I think that it is not secular in the sense that sectarianism is part of the system. It is not, it's basically parceling access to power and resources on the basis of your madhab, not even like religion. We're really talking about ta'ifa. But it is not, it is secular in the sense that it will not allow the religious leaders to actually dictate or intervene in these policies, and that actually is not a small thing in secularism. I mean, my point about Al-Majlis al-Shi'i al-A'la and its creation is that we tend sometimes to think that this is an acknowledgement by the state of the expansion in the clerical authority, let's say, that the Shiites had. Actually, it may be a better way to manage them, to open this secular space, whereby you give the family and you give the sect legal articulation and allow the state to intervene actually more directly. So they are interconnected, but I mean, the question, Roshanak, is a very important question. What would you consider secular? It also has to do what you would define as secularism. And there are, even in the very definition of secularism in the European context, you have very different, you have even among the British secularists who started to use it, like Holyoke, there was a division between the two. Are you going to leave religion alone, or are you going to actually form an organization against religion? And I think that Imam Sayyid Musa al-Sadr's project was not about public religion. I think that's Hezbollah's project, public religion. But that he is a precursor, that faith, as he said, is not an abstraction. Faith has a role, and the man of faith has a role. But it has not, I think, in terms of probably degree or quality, has been pushed to the level of a public religion. I don't know, that's my thinking.
So if you think about it, that citizenship in Lebanon, you cannot be a citizen of Lebanon unless you belong to a religious community. So in that sense, you're not, and you don't have equal access to power, depending on your, you don't have to, yeah, I'm sorry.
I think that secularism itself needs to be problematized as a concept, because the French tradition of secularism, or laïcité, going back to Voltaire and so forth, is militantly anti-religious. And you think about the Jacobins in France and so forth. But that kind of secularism is distinctive in particular times and places. I mean, the Soviets basically adopted that point of view, and Turkey under Ataturk. But most places in the world, in Latin America, the United States, much of Europe, Germany certainly, didn't adopt that kind of militant anti-religious secularism. Like in 1905, members of the French cabinet in the Third Republic weren't allowed to attend Mass. If you went to Mass, you'd be thrown off the cabinet. But that's not the case in the United States, or Colombia, or Bolivia, or Germany, or Lebanon. And it seems to me that when you say secularism in Lebanon, or what people tend to mean by it in Lebanon, is different in the sense that religion has a role in society and life, but parliament is sovereign. And that seems to me, in Lebanon, like in Iraq, they passed this provision that the civil parliament may make no law contrary to Sharia. And there is no such provision in the Lebanese constitution. And it seems to me you couldn't have Sharia or canon law or any of these religious systems dictate the whole of governmental policy because they are all diverse within them. So I think the state and the sort of the sovereignty of parliament functions to mediate amongst the religious laws and the religious communities, and that's probably what they mean by secularism. And incidentally, in South Asia, in India, they use the word secular in exactly the same way. But it has religious overtones for them that is tolerant of religion and incorporates religion. But they don't mean it in the Jacobin sense.
Yeah, okay. Let me,
Yes,
and then
I would like to add one thing. The military wing of Amal was created direct reaction to the Israeli occupation and the bombardment of the south, and it was not against the PLO or the communism. So this is what...
The military wing was created in 1974.
Yes, but there was
no occupation in 74.
Yes, there was a bombardment since...
Well, the bombardment was coming because the Palestinians had started attacking
Well,
Israel.
this is who created the egg or the chicken. So there was a continuous bombardment of Lebanon. That was a reason. There was Israeli aggression, and it's continued until now.
Yes, yes. Yes, the question is what would be the difference between Sayyid Musa al-Sadr's approach to faith and religion and that of Hezbollah? Yes. Well, for Hezbollah, religion is not a private matter that you can actually confine to certain areas. And Muslim believers cannot remain and cannot be actually indifferent to the way the state legislates, or introduces, for example, textbooks in the educational system, the schools. I take education as one example. You have to be able to shape civil society, but also to shape state policies. And public religion is about bringing together and not separating at many levels what the state is interested in doing and what civilians, in civil society do. It's an expansion in the I think probably not, utility is not a good word. It's an expansion in the relevance of faith for questions of the state authority, and also power and empowerment. That is very much about the state. For Hezbollah, it's really also, although you will find also that with Sayyid Musa al-Sadr, it's with Sayyid Musa al-Sadr, the Shiites have to become citizens and actually enter the state through an interfaith with the secular legal aspect of the state. With Hezbollah, you have to change that. You actually have to bring the state to understand that these domains are not separate. That's why Madaris al-Mahdi, I know Professor Roshanak talked a lot about the textbooks that are being taught in Madaris al-Mahdi. You cannot teach that, for example, in the mainstream public educational system in Lebanon. They will not admit these textbooks, for example. Yeah.
Well, I have two sort of interrelated questions about that deal both with the beginnings of this whole story and with the end. So about the beginnings, I would like the panelists to address a little bit more the intellectual formation of Musa al-Sadr. So many of you have emphasized his secular education in Iran, and on the other hand, Professor Norton yesterday has emphasized his role as a pragmatist, and one has called him the bricoleur. And so I wonder which role this secular education actually plays in this. Has it been studied in detail? It has been mentioned that he did also economic and theoretical studies. What kind of ideas are there? Are they related to his activities later on? Or are these the bricks that the bricoleur is afterwards using? Or is there actually detachment, and his secular studies are just what Roland calls being all things to all people, that this is something that we like about him. So that's the first part. And at the other end, I would like all of you also to address a little bit more of the heritage part. Of course, we have heard in many different forms about what happened to the movement after his disappearance. But I also wonder if there is a form of an intellectual heritage that can be influential today. And that also addresses the question of the pragmatism. So if this is all contextual and contingent on a particular historical conjuncture, and Professor Norton yesterday again was indicating that his influence was actually already declining in the latter half of the 70s. So what I would like you to also speak a little bit to the degree to which there is a heritage that can be taken up again and can be carried on in Lebanon today.
I just want to, what I think is that his secular education, the fact that he went to a university made him really, he was part of the debates that were shaping the secularists and leftists. And so he wasn't a detached sort of alim sitting in Rome or Najaf. Not that all of them did not have an idea about what's going on, but he understood their language and he knew what was going on. And he was able to sort of address that sort of modernist, their desire to be modern and sort of the ability, he was able to combine that modernity with the faith that he was so well known for it, the combination
but,
of that.
Imam Qazvini was also pointing out how many of descendants of the great ulama turn atheist and communist, so one wonders if that's actually an informative part of it.
There's a lot of questions there, so they're all sidesteppable. But I think, and it's been alluded to, that I don't think there would be a conference of this sort, or of this size perhaps. We wouldn't be here in 2008 talking about Musa al-Sadr if he had stayed in Iran. He had obvious charisma, he had the training in Najaf, but a lot of his career owes to the fact that he was moving to a new land. It's been said, he came from a huge country, and he came to this place which is 70% the size of Connecticut. So he, was not impressed by these insurmountable distances between Baalbek and the south, and he traveled widely, and this impressed people. So a lot of the heritage we can speak about is just the fact that he was so new to them. His credentials impressed the people who had been locally trained. So the biggest thing that can come out of this, I hope, is a research agenda, and that is exactly that. And this is what I'm trying to start with this conference, is precisely that need to go into the intellectual formation. Anytime somebody mentions Musa al-Sadr at a conference, there's a question about Shariati, and say, oh, yes, he influenced him, or Shariat influenced him, or leftists, and he was co-opting the language of leftism. So that has been covered, but not in depth. There's a wealth of writings that he wrote that were translated into Arabic, but originally he wrote in Persian on Islamic economics and all this, where we don't exactly know what the intellectual direct inspirations were. So that's sidestepping question number one. But anybody else want to?
I wanted to say something else about your second question. And what I argue in my book, it's not that Musa al-Sadr was unique in terms of his charisma, or that he was tall, or had green eyes, or all of those things, or that he had a secular education. I think what was most important about him, what he fundamentally changed, was, when that was unique about him, that he gave a new vision of Lebanese identity, and I'm saying, and that it was because he sort of adapted partially the Maronite nationalist vision of Lebanon. So his nationalism, his Shiite nationalism, was a modular form of Maronite nationalism. It was not a radical break with the vision of the Maronite nation, just as the secularists had envisioned, the total secularization of the state. That could not, but he sort of talked about the partial secularization. Why so much emphasizing the idea that coexistence is important? And that's where I think the idea of public religion comes into the matter. He coupled those two ideas, piety and coexistence go hand in hand, and that's something where I think that actually Hezbollah is continuing the path of Musa al-Sadr in emphasizing those two parts. So, no, we as Lebanese are not secular people, but we are also not under the hegemony of the Maronite state. So that is what I think is special and unique about what he did. And he changed the whole discourse about Lebanese-ness and opened that space where all the Islamists now competing with each other about who is more pious than the other person. I think that's what the formula is, while also having some sort of a dialogue with the Maronites about coexistence, and those people thinking, oh yeah, he's talking about us, while in fact he was really fundamentally changing the meaning of coexistence as well, and changing the power relations behind that. So, that's what I
Did you want to add something about this point? The last, you said something toward the end, I'm sorry that I didn't hear, about atheism or something of this sort, the last sentence.
No, sorry,
No?
I've not
No?
addressed
Okay.
atheism.
I mean, I
No.
One additional aspect. When we talk about heritage, I think you're right, Godfrey. That's the aspect that's ignored in favor of the legacy aspect, because it's easier to see, cause versus effect, rather than seeing that there were a number of continuities in the tradition that he came into. For instance, many of the charitable organizations that he revitalized were, at least active when he came. For instance, the Jamaat, I don't think he founded. He revitalized it. The idea of founding a Shia council, an actual juridical organ for the Shia, so that they wouldn't be represented, religiously in government by the Sunni Mufti, was an idea that had been proposed to the French authorities by the clerics and the Zaims in the early 1930s. They wanted a Majlis al-Shia al-Ala. They had asked for it. Did not come about, obviously. So there are continuities. I mean, we don't want to caricature again this distinction between Shia quietude and irrelevance previously, as if they hadn't thought to demand equal rights. But it was in reframing it, I think, in terms of rights, in terms of citizens, that was crucial to the success. Previously, when the religious leaders had gone to the French authorities, there was a French delegate based in Saida, maybe, and they were stressing their loyalty to France and the French Republic as the reason they should be given more, given roads and greater water structures. That changed completely. All of a sudden, you hear the word citizen, which the French introduced to Lebanon. So it's an interesting little twist of historical coincidence.